Welcome, everyone. I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Thank you for joining us for another round of open government lessons. During this class, you'll learn how to work outside the public records law in your state to get the documents you need. Maybe you made a public records request and were denied. You appealed the denial and again were told that the records you need are off limits. Meanwhile, your deadline is looming and a story needs to be written. What can you do when your state's public records law doesn't work in your favor and you find yourself out of options? We'll soon hear how reporter Sawyer Loftus answered that question. If you haven't already, please view our previous classes on public records, open meetings, and the state court system. The lessons they provide are all cumulative, starting you off with the basics and then gradually addressing more nuanced areas of the law and journalism practice. The classes are state-specific and provide practical step-by-step lessons you won't find anywhere else. You can find them all in our FOI guide at nefac.org/FOI guide and on our YouTube channel, 5 Freedoms. Before we begin, I want to also recognize the estate of Gloria L. Negri for its support of these classes. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years. This program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. You can learn more about Gloria and other NEFAC supporters at nefac.org/supporters. During today's presentation, I encourage you again to introduce yourself in the chat and share your own experiences and resources. You can also use the chat or the Q&A button to ask questions of our instructors. We'll get to as many of those questions as possible. Sawyer, thank you for being here. All yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. Once again, I am Sawyer Loftus. I'm a reporter with the Bangor Daily News on the Bangor Daily News's main focus team, which is its investigative team. Today, we're going to go over 3 stories that I had a pretty tricky time getting public records for. Each story covers a different aspect of going beyond the public records law to get access to records, but I want to frame kind of at the start that largely there's a underlying theme, which is sourcing, and I think that sometimes some of my colleagues will often look for a public record that they hope to be their sort of silver bullet for their story, but ultimately, even in the public records realm, sourcing matters. So yeah, we'll dive right in with the first story. So this first story is from September of 2023, and it was about the death of a man in police custody in Maine. I'd covered the initial arrest in the news. I wrote a breaking news brief back in March 2022 when Jeremy Lau, the man who died in custody, when that initial information was released that he had died in custody. He was arrested by officers from the Maine State Police as well as the Penobscot County Sheriff's Office after someone had called 911 asking for help, reporting that he was allegedly vandalizing her house and threatening the people inside. And so initially, I mean, we had this press release come in that there was an in-custody death, and from that very moment, I think it was maybe a day or two after, I filed a public records request because I knew that the Attorney General's office was going to have to investigate this and determine what took place, if there was any criminal activity that led to his death on the part of the police. And I mean, anytime someone dies in the custody of law enforcement, you want to take a closer look. However, those records, weren't immediately available because it was still part of an ongoing investigation. And it wasn't until late one night in early September, it was more than a full year after Jeremy had died in custody, that I got an email in my inbox. I, at that point, had been checking in regularly with the Attorney General's office, asking for these records. Never getting a firm denial, but also never getting a firm, we're going to provide these records. And it just so happened that a source of mine, who he is named in this story, Doug Dunbar, he is a local guy in the Bangor area he does a lot of outreach with folks who are suffering from addiction and homelessness. He had put in a records request for the same records I did. uh, and neither of us knew. And he had forwarded it an email he had gotten from the Attorney General's office uh, with the full investigative report. He got the public records that I didn't get. And so he forwarded me his whole chain with the Attorney General's office and said, he said, I think this might be of interest to you. And so I took a look, and there was this pretty kind of explosive report in there about what led up to this man's death in custody that was previously sort of hidden behind bureaucratic red tape and just no comments all around from all the law enforcement agencies. And so what the record eventually showed, it was the everything that was public within the Attorney General's investigative files as the case was closed. The records indicated that the officers had shocked Mr. Lau with a taser multiple times. They had hit him in the head with a flashlight, and then he was handcuffed face down in a prone position, and ultimately died in that position. And in fact, the Maine's chief medical examiner at the time, who did the autopsy, determined that the cause of death was a sudden cardiac death following restraint in the prone position. And he listed the cause as the cause and manner as homicide, which again is not a criminal term. Murder is the criminal term attached to it. Homicide just means, in the context of autopsies, that the manner of death was not by one's own doing or by natural causes. It was caused by someone else. And so we wrote this story that illuminated, something that is pretty rare in Maine, which is an individual dying in custody, which is really significant. Anytime a law enforcement officer uses their ultimate power of, taking a life, it warrants scrutiny. And again, I had requested the same records and was not getting those records. And it just so happened that a source that I regularly was communicating with about the different stuff going on in Bangor around homelessness and addiction treatment options, who I never had really included in a story before then. He is always on my periphery as like one of those guys that's just good to talk to and check in with, get a cup of coffee every once in a while or hop on a phone call. And he thought of me when he got these records, and he was able to pass them along, and we were able to produce this story that again shone a light on something that was again shrouded in secrecy. You can go ahead to the next slide, Justin. The next story I want to talk about is one that was called it was Not Everyone Got Homes After Bangor Cleared a Homeless Encampment. It's not a very beautiful headline, but it does the trick. It was the summation of an investigation I did that published in October of 2023. Just for point of context here, earlier that year, Bangor had partnered with a team of experts that were supplied by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to deal with its very visible homelessness issue. It's not an uncommon sight in Bangor to see encampments of homeless people. And Bangor is one of the last service centers in the state before you get further north. And so it had kind of reached homelessness had kind of reached a peak in the city in early 2023 that necessitated this highly technical team from HUD that had worked in Seattle and Los Angeles, all with the goal of rapidly rehousing folks who were currently unhoused. So Bangor enlisted their help. And the goal was, let's clear this encampment of people from city-owned property that sits along the Kenduskeag Stream. Now, at the time, there were two larger encampments in the city of Bangor. There was one that sat just outside of one of the shelters, which is commonly referred to as Tent City. That one recently got disbanded. This one was a slightly smaller one than that. That was just outside of downtown Bangor along this stream. Now, the stream is important. because the removal of folks from this encampment happened to coincide with a very popular canoe race that goes through the Kenduskeag. But we'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, so I dug into this process because the city manager at the time, Debbie Laurie, had described the work of rehousing the folks that were at this encampment that, fluctuated between 20 and 30 people at any given time as being successful. And so I of course wanted to know, like, well, what does that mean? Because there was not necessarily a noticeable or perceivable impact on the amount of extremely visible homelessness that was apparent walking through downtown or anywhere in Bangor. And so we requested all of the records that had to do with this encampment clearing and sweeping. I had filed a public records request that was pretty sweeping, but I had done a lot of pre-reporting ahead of time, talking to sources at various levels of city government or that are service providers, asking, like, if I wanted to get to this and get to the heart of the actual work, what were the sort of key phrases or key dates that I would need to include in my request. And initially, the request was denied, and then we pushed back and said, well, you got to give us a reason for denying it. And then it eventually became this game of the city kind of slow rolling the release of records. Now, we did ask for a lot of records, and we ended up getting back hundreds of pages of emails and communications and working memos between the city and this technical assistance team from the Department of Housing and Urban Development about the work that but to get there, it took a lot of extra effort. So we filed the request. The request is in part denied. And so I just kind of didn't take that as an acceptable answer and kept pushing and asking why. And then they finally agreed and said, okay, we'll give you the records. But when they gave us the records, we found when reviewing them that they had redacted certain information that definitely shouldn't have been. Specifically, the goal of this project was to evaluate whether or not people actually were rehomed, if they were able to get into permanent housing, which is by all means like the kind of pinnacle of success when it comes to clearing a homeless encampment. And so, of course, we wanted the records that showed like where these people went. And initially, the city provided us with these records, but they redacted the names of landlords, addresses, and other details of buildings that they had tried to send people to. And they initially said that it was because the city initially said they cited federal guidance that said any records that touch welfare assistance as provided by the Department of Housing and Urban Development is considered confidential. But I did a little research, and again, we were dealing with records that were not under the jurisdiction of the federal government. These were records that were maintained and prepared by, for the most part, city officials. Additionally, we weren't interested in any sort of personally identifiable information about the recipients. We didn't want to know the names of the people who had been rehoused. We wanted to know just where they went. And typically in the state of Maine, your address is considered directory information. So there was no real grounds for redacting that. And so it was this very long and drawn out back and forth between myself, my editor at the time got involved with the city and the city's attorney. Because in the state of Maine, when you get denied a public records request, the formal appeals process is filing a lawsuit, which for a newspaper like the Bangor Daily News is not a luxury we have. Lawsuits are expensive. While we have a really excellent attorney that we work with often, filing a lawsuit is not what we want to do. And so because that just slows everything down even more than it already is. And so you have to find these creative ways to kind of push. And so in this case, I leaned on sources again. I leaned on sources on the city council and said, look, like, do you guys even know that the city has withheld this information? Did you know that we kind of feel pretty strongly here that this is information that's been withheld that absolutely shouldn't be? Um, and I also, again, was extremely persistent with the city and simply did not take no for an answer. I can't even remember the amount of times I had to correspond with them and explain my position over and over again that these records were being withheld in a way that did not comply with Maine public records law. Uh, and eventually, we did enlist the help of an attorney to help us sort of like draft the messaging around like what can I say that, can kind of ironclad this language legally when we're going back and forth with the city. But ultimately, the city uh, relented. It was weeks of me emailing the city manager and the city solicitor at least once a week. And then they finally said, okay, you're right. Like, we'll give you the information that you wanted. And they ended up supplying all the records um, without the erroneous or the redactions that we believed did not comply with Maine law. Um, but I think the really interesting part about this one is that two other people had requested the same exact information I did. Only my records were unredacted. They never got the other two requesters never got unredacted records. And I also know because I interviewed those folks for a story that we did, and you can go to the next slide, Justin, which is I think mentioned here in the next slide. Oh no, well, we'll get there in a minute. So we wrote a subsequent story. We wrote the investigation, which did find that the majority of people that were cleared from that encampment were not, the city didn't know what happened to them. They stopped tracking them because there was no way to track them. And so there was no way to like really completely guarantee or determine success. Um, and we ended up writing a secondary story that was just explaining to some extent how we got the records, because one of the things I actually learned going through the New England First Amendment Coalition's annual training seminar was this concept of potty training. In the state of Maine, you'll hear lots of FOA experts, so Freedom of Access Act experts, refer to this term of potty training agencies, which are pushing back every time you get a denial, because again, the presumption under Maine's freedom of access law is that everything that the government does should be public, and that there should be a very limited set of things that are not public. And so this was it was important to publish like this secondary piece, just to not to shame the city, because I truly do not believe they were acting in like a nefarious way. They were genuinely trying to like protect people. It was more of a misunderstanding of like what we wanted to do with the information and what the information would show. And so again, it took a lot of negotiating and a lot of pressure, but they eventually relented. Um, but yeah, so I'll move ahead. Yep, good. Justin already moved to the next slide. So this next story was I wrote recently with ProPublica. The Bangor Daily News also published it. It was about all these foreclosures that were filed in federal court in Maine. Uh, the kind of context here is that we found that 56 foreclosures had been filed in federal court as of starting in early March. All but one of them was in the state of Maine. This investigation is like really in depth, so like I definitely encourage you to go read it if you haven't. And I won't give you all the context now. But the important piece to know is that there's two little bits of information in this like larger piece that are really important. Um, and they're highlighted on this slide. And it's these two pieces of data that we got from sources within the federal government Now, both of these, you may be looking at these lines, which are the first one is referencing the number of active loans in the USDA's portfolio that were considered delinquent. That information currently is considered not public to the USDA. And so we filed a FOIA for it, but still to this day, the story has been published for weeks now. Still to this day, I have never received a response, with an estimate of time to hear back as to whether or not this data would be released at all. And so the other piece of data that's in there too is the breakdown of employees who took offers that were called deferred resignations or buyouts from the Trump administration to reduce the overall federal workforce. Again, that data and information was not currently accessible by the public, but there is this whole database that the federal government keeps called FedScope that is staffing levels. So again, we filed a FOIA request for that same information. As those who are familiar with FOIA and the current climate of the federal government know that FOIAs are just not happening right now. The process is extremely slow. So the deadline was looming. We had to get this story done. And so I started by going through my network of core sources that I knew sort of touched this program that was administrated by the USDA or knew anything about it. And I said, look, I really need to get information that's like critical context for this piece. Because, part of the process when we were doing this investigation was determining, is this something that is only happening in Maine? And to that end, what we tried to do was get national data on the loan portfolio. And so both of these pieces of information came from two different sources that I cannot name or describe specifically because they gave them to us on the condition of anonymity. But the way that we obtained these pieces of information were just like layers of sourcing. I started with this core group of experts and folks kind of like in my federal government Rolodex that I knew touched this program, and said, hey, I'm looking for this information. Like, can you help us? And often the answer was, I can't, but let me see if someone in my network can. And eventually through that kind of game of telephone, I was able to reach two different people through secure communications means that were able to share and like verify the veracity of these two pieces of data. They actually shared them in in a primary source format. And so we were able to use that data and run with it. And again, it's two small pieces in a really large story, but it just goes to show again, like this theme that I hope you all are taking away from this is that even if you're told no, there's typically a way to get around it. And also it really just comes down to a lot of the times sourcing, you keep asking, someone has got to know. There's not just one person that has one document squirreled away somewhere. Like you just kind of have to find not necessarily the weaker link, but the link that is supportive of public access to government information and records. So that's what I've got for you guys. I'm happy to take any questions or chat a little more here. We've got a few more minutes left.
Thank you, Sawyer. Really appreciate all this information. I do have one question for you, but first, just for those joining us, you mentioned in the third example using the Federal Freedom of Information Act, separate from Maine state law. And I would encourage anyone who's unfamiliar with federal FOIA or would like to learn more, again, go to our FOI guide, mefac.org/FOI guide, and you'll see a number of tutorials there, not only on Maine state law, but also on the Federal Freedom of Information Act. Question for you, though, Sawyer, before we wrap up, I think just to kind of bring us home on this issue and provide us a little bit more context. How often do you run into situations where you are making requests for documents that you are clearly entitled to under the law? You go through all of the administrative appeals process, you do everything within the law to get those documents, but you're still left empty-handed. Is this a common occurrence, or are these examples that you shared with us today the exception?
It's fairly common. I actually had a kind of tough time whittling down examples for this. There was one, there was one story that I didn't include that I can give you a brief summation of. I requested also in 2023 from every single police department in the state of Maine. So we're talking north of 150 law enforcement agencies, the same policy that they were all supposed to have. And you would be shocked at the amount of angry phone calls I got from police chiefs that were like, why do you want this? Why do you want this? Which, again, is not an outright denial, but under Maine public records law, the reason why can't be considered. It's not a consideration for a denial. And ultimately, what happened was there was a group of law enforcement agencies, again, still to this day, that never responded to the public records request. And it just simply was not worth our time and money to file a lawsuit against 20 law enforcement agencies over one record. But it is fairly common. I routinely run into, I will say that there are certain agencies that have gotten better about sharing information and understanding like why it is we want information. Like while public records law in Maine does not dictate that you have to have a purpose for the records, it is always helpful to give more context and like be transparent. Like you're asking these agencies to be transparent with you. And so a key part of my reporting process is always answering those questions and being transparent with them and getting on that phone call with the public records officer and saying, like, I know that you guys don't want to give me this, but like, here's the reasons why under the law you have to, but more importantly, like, this is why I'm doing it. And I found that is a pretty good tactic to like help reduce those barriers. But again, it is fairly common to run into those.
Got it. Oh, thank you, Sawyer. Really appreciate this lesson and all of this information. Very helpful strategies and great context for all of us as we proceed with our own public record requests. Thank you again, and thank you for all the work that you do at the Bangor Daily News. Really appreciate all your reporting. Also, big thanks to everyone who joined us today. We provide these lessons as a public service to you, so please return the favor and encourage colleagues and friends to join us for all of these lessons. You can find them all on the calendar right at nefac.org. Registration links are live. Go there. Please join us week to week, month to month. We have many programs to offer, and we also have a lot to learn from each other. So I look forward to seeing you all again soon. On behalf of NEFAC, thank you for all you do, and take care, everyone. Bye now.